Hello, folks. Welcome back. If you're coming back, if this is your first time, welcome aboard. It's me, Miss T.I., and I'm here for some more spooky stories. Cheers, friends. Kind of wish we could be around a campfire someplace. It's such a warm night, feels like summer. Um, but this will be as close as we can get for now. Besides, around a campfire, I wouldn't be able to concentrate, and all you yayos would be drinking and laughing and carrying on, and be hard to hear. Oh, wait, you're not my relative, so it would probably work just fine. Anyway, welcome back. I'm here for another spooky story tonight. Since it is Memorial Day weekend, I wanted to tell a story about one of my ancestors. Is now an ancestor, and this is my Gramps. My Gramps, I have to tell you a little backstory about him so you understand who he was who he is in spirit, and have a little understanding of his nature and his character. So my Gramps was born in New Orleans right around the turn of the last century, and his family lived on St. Anne Street in the Treme, which was a thriving community of people of color, businesses of color. It was like its own thriving community. And this is where my grandfather was born. Well, what happened though is, I don't know how much history y'all know, but at the end of the 19th century, there was a Supreme Court ruling called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court said that separate but equal was constitutional. And what that did is that opened up the floodgate of all of the Jim Crow laws in the South. And suddenly a community that had quite a bit of status was now sidelined and discriminated against, and unable to continue to make a living, even in terms of my great-grandparents. Things just got really ugly. If you know any history at all, black legislators were kicked out and people just lost everything. But this was the world that my grandpa was born in New Orleans. Now his two aunts, Nanny and Deds, Denise and Antoinette, who I am named after, Antoinette Marie, and that's also my name, they had left New Orleans and as part of the Great Migration and had gone north to Chicago. Now, the story that was told openly in my family was that Deds had married a drunk who beat her. And so she had the marriage annulled, and she and her sister went to Chicago with their little baby, and with Denise's baby, and set up a life in Chicago. And that's the story that I heard as a child. My mother told me another story, and this one is a little more interesting. She wrote all this stuff down. It's in her papers. I'm not sure if this is part of the story, but similar tales have been told by other cousins and other relatives that heard about a story like this. So it kind of confirms it. Anyway, the story is that Deds was engaged to be married, and she was pregnant before the wedding. This was not as uncommon as one might think. It isn't uncommon now, and it wasn't uncommon then. But her fiance, apparently, as the story goes, was challenged to a duel. And it was supposed to be at dawn up on the levee. And he told Deds, his fiance, he gave her a box with his papers and his money and, all of his things, and said if he wasn't back by noon to get a ticket and take a train north. And the reason for that is that if he didn't come back, then she would just be an unmarried, pregnant Creole woman of color and would have no prospects in the South at all. Her only choice at that point being like the brothels kind of thing. Women who got themselves in trouble had a very hard time of it. So they waited and waited, and noon passed, and he didn't come back. And so the next day, they used the money, and Denise and Nanny and Dad's got tickets to Chicago, took the cash with them, took the baby, and went to Chicago, where they made the story that she was escaping a brutal husband and had it, or no, that's why she still had her birth name. So they lived, when they first moved there, they lived in a Greek neighborhood. And they wrote back to my great-grandfather and great-grandmother and told them that they should come north. My great-grandfather was pretty fair-skinned. Everyone knew that he was a person of color. But, once you were a person of color, you were a person of color. There was the single drop rule, the whole thing. My great-grandmother looked a little more ethnic, quote-unquote, but they were all fair-skinned and really able to pass for white. So my great aunts said that in this Greek neighborhood, there were people who lived all around them that were darker skinned than they were, and they were treated as though they were white, and they just fit in and passed for white. In New Orleans, this is called passe blanche. So my great-grandfather and grandmother decided this was what they were going to do. They were going to leave New Orleans and go to Chicago. Now, at that time, you couldn't tell people that you were doing this because, first of all, you had to keep it a secret. If you were going to pass, you had to create an entire new story and leave your entire culture, all your friends, your family behind. This was not an easy thing to do. And so they didn't tell anyone. And they got up one morning, and they had packed as much as they could carry in the bags that they could carry. And they caught a train from New Orleans to St. Louis, and you had to buy a ticket and be in the colored, quote-unquote, colored car. Now, as a kid, and I heard about the train, the segregated trains, I pictured, just separate passenger cars, but this is not the way it was back then. White passengers sat in the passenger cars. People of color sat on benches in the baggage cars, unsecured benches in the baggage cars. And you paid the same price for the ticket. Anyway, that's a little history lesson there. But so they went to St. Louis in the colored section. They got out and they spent hours and hours walking about, going to a park, sitting on a park bench. And then after they were sure there was nobody in the train station that had been there when they got off the train and might recognize them, they went back to the train station, they bought another ticket, and they got on the regular passenger car. And that was the moment that they passed for white, that they were passe blanche. And they went to Chicago. And then they all moved to the north side. And my grandfather, his parents kept it a secret. You had to keep it a secret. Even though there was not Jim Crow in the North, there was and is systemic racism, and people of color just have a much more difficult time and would have. So it had to be this big secret. I remember my Uncle Phil telling a story once about after it all came out, after the big secret was blown out, after my grandpa died, that they, as a little boy, they sitting around the kitchen table and listening to the parents talk about family members in New Orleans who wanted to come up for the World's Fair. And they talked about them and about which ones looked good enough, seriously, good enough to come. Not white enough, not non-ethnic enough, but good enough to be able to come, because if relatives who looked darker and would give them away and it would blow their secret. It was awful. So my grandfather lived this secret and this new identity his whole life. He was a businessman. He said he taught his sons to never work for someone else. And he told the story of when he was a little boy. He was a busboy, or not a busboy, a bellboy in a fancy tourist hotel in New Orleans as a young boy, like 7, 8 years old. And his mother was a maid there. They couldn't let anyone know that they were related, because if you were a person of color, you could not have direct contact with the white customers. So all the bellmen or bellboys were white, and the maids and dishwashers and people like that were people of color. So he told the story about how one time he was carrying some bags up to a room, and he heard someone shouting, and he came around a corner, and he saw his mother standing there, and a white man slapped her across the face and called her filthy names, is what he said. And he slipped back around the corner. He didn't tell us about it being about the color issue back then, because he never admitted any of that, but he said he saw his mother being berated by a man, and he slipped around the corner so that his mother would not know that he saw this and be ashamed. And he waited till the coast was clear and then brought the bags there. And it was after he told that story that I learned about the rules about who got what jobs. But he was adamant, you need to have your own business. Do not work for someone else. Do not be dependent on someone else for your living. And he lived that. And he helped his sons start their businesses, who helped others, and he was very successful. He started a safety equipment company that survived the Depression, and he was somebody that was so determined. Well, for example, like in the 80s, in the early 80s, mid 80s, my mother decided to look up our genealogy and find our family history. She was just fascinated with finding out the history. There were all these stories that had been passed down. And so she went to New Orleans, and she went to the archives and the clerk's offices, and she pulled up document after document and traced our family all the way back to 1702, by the way. But she found my grandfather's birth certificate. And as she was looking at it, excuse me a minute. Everybody drink. Cheers. She was looking at his birth certificate and saw that under race it said colored. And this was curious to her, because this was not the story she heard. She heard that this whole story about this whole French family and, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there was a whole backstory to go with the Passé Blanc. So she brought the birth certificate to my grandfather's house, and he was living in a suburb outside of Chicago near where she lived. And she just brought it into him and said, "Hey, Dad, I've been looking at our family history, and I found your birth certificate. What does this mean?" And he grew livid, and he grabbed it out of her hand, and he said, "Get out of my house and never speak a word of this to anyone, and never speak a word of this to me ever again. Get out now, and you're not welcome here if you ever talk about this again." And my mother was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, okay. So she left. She didn't speak to him about it anymore, and she didn't spread it around. She told her children, a few of us, because she was excited about finding the family history and knew that we wouldn't throw her out because of it. But after he passed, she was able to share all this history and this record of our family and where we had actually come from. But my grandfather kept that secret and guarded that secret his whole life. My grandfather was the kind of guy who had a very specific way of doing things. He liked things his way, and he made sure things were done his way. He was very quirky, almost to the point of OCD. For example, some of his quirks, he had a cottage up in Wisconsin, and a place where we'd go and stay in the summer before we had the place where Evelyn resided. But in his cabin, he had a tool house, and in the tool house, he had all the tools that he needed. And what he did is he hung them all up on a pegboard, And then he took powder blue spray paint and painted over all of the tools so that everyone would know his tools, because one half of them was painted powder blue, and he could walk into his tool house and look up at that pegboard and know instantly if a tool was missing. And if a tool was missing, he would bellow, "Where's my screwdriver?" And we would all scramble looking for the screwdriver. Whether or not we used it, we would all just, go find Gramps. You know, he was like this huge looming presence. His friends called him, well, anyway, and then he'd put the screwdriver back. I'll get back to the other part. He also, in his tool house, had a system for all of the little pieces, like nails and screws and washers and all that stuff. And he had this wall of these little cardboard boxes. There were the boxes that his safety classes would be sold in, just gray cardboard boxes, and each one was numbered. And then he had one of those old address books that had where you go to the tab of like N, and you'd go N, nails, half-inch nails, quarter-inch nails, finishing nails, and after each kind of nail, this whole page of nails had a number. And so you'd look if you wanted finishing nails or roofing nails. You'd say 122, you'd go to box 122, and there would be the roofing nails. And if you got to the bottom of something in a box, if you took the second to last one or the last one, you had to tell him immediately so that he could replenish it, because it was a day's trip to go to town and replenish those supplies. And if he was in the middle of a project and opened up a box and it was empty, he'd have a fit. He'd freak out about it. So he was very meticulous with his things. He also had a number of other little quirky things. He used to, I remember as a little girl, I don't know if I told you this in another story, but he would sit, and his coffee, he would take a spoonful of butter and he would dip it in the sugar, and then he'd stir it in his coffee, and then he'd dip it again in the sugar and stir it and sip this butter and coffee and sugar. And I was just fascinated by that. We didn't get butter and coffee and sugar in our coffee. We got milk and sugar in our coffee. Yes, we got coffee. He also did this thing where after a meal, he would sit at the head of the table, and he was so fun. He had these wonderful stories and jokes. He was like the original storyteller, where I learned my chops from my Gramps. He was amazing. But he'd tell jokes and little short stories and long stories, and he'd sit and suck on his false teeth to get the food out. And meanwhile, he would scoop all the crumbs off the tabletop and scoop them into his hand. And I was watched with fascination. I loved his hands. He had this smooth skin. He had almost no hair on his arms, and this brown, smooth skin with these long fingers and pink fingernails. They weren't painted. They were just really pink fingernails. And he would scoop all this into his hand, and I would watch. You'd think that then you'd put them on the plate or something, get them off the table, but no. My grandpa would take these crumbs and he would scatter them on the floor. Now, I remember this because I got in trouble for doing the same thing once at my house. And I scooped the crumbs from the table. Now, granted, it probably had big globs of sticky rice and Kool-Aid and God knows what else from our table. And I remember scooping it in my hand and tossing it on the floor like my grandpa, just gleefully. I was little, maybe 4 or 5 years old. And I remember my mother saying, "What are you doing?" and grabbing me out of my chair and giving me a swat on my butt and say, "Go get the broom and sweep that up right now." And I learned quick that only Gramps could scoop crumbs onto the floor, and that I should not probably do that. So I didn't. He used to also, when I was a teenager, we would go help him when my grandma was sick, and he was there, and we'd help with the chores and sweeping the cabin. The cabin had, it was one great room, with an open concept before open concepts were a thing. And so you had this great big room with this linoleum floor. And to sweep the floor, you had to sweep starting in the same corner every time. And you had to scoop it around towards this one door, I suppose the front door kind of door by the kitchen. And then he had this tin, ancient kind of wobbly tin dustpan with the rubber strip, and you'd sweep it into that dustpan, and it was kind of copper colored, like fake copper dustpan. Maybe it was copper, I don't know. And then you had to bring it to him at the table. You couldn't just dump it in the trash because it was full of sand. I mean, up north was super sandy, and your trash bags would probably weigh 50 pounds if you put all the sand from the floor in them. So he'd look at that dustpan sitting at the table, and on the table he had an aluminum ashtray, and he would pick through that dustpan and pull out any little thread or hairs, or if there was a little shard of paper or anything at all, mostly threads and hair and stuff like that. If there was any, like, somebody clipped their nail and it was in there, he would pick that out and put it in the ashtray so that it was only the sand and the stones and just the earth dirt. And then you had to carefully carry that out through the back door, the front door, I don't know what it was, through the door, down the steps of the stoop, and out past. They had this big, huge, like, camp bell that they'd ring when everyone was on the lake to say dinner was ready, or if there was a phone call or somebody needed to come back to the house. It was like the bell you could hear on the entire lake. And so you had to go past the bell and toss it over the hill. And there was this big hill that went down to the lake, so you had to toss it in the same place and make sure that you banged it out so there was nothing left, and then bring the dustpan back in. He also made sure that the front and back stoop were swept multiple times a day. And, it's the outside stoop, and I get it. You're trekking sand in, so you got to get the sand off the stoop. But, wouldn't you just sweep it off the stoop? Because there wasn't sidewalk on the side. It was just dirt and, moss and pine cones on the side there. And then the sidewalk went out around. But no, you couldn't sweep it off the side. You had to sweep that into the dustpan, and you had to bring it in to get all the stuff that didn't belong outside out of it, and take it to the same place and dump it over the hill. These were some of his just very almost OCD kinds of things. Oh, another thing was stirring the pot. I was helping my grandma make cream of wheat, and she showed me how to stir, where you stir small circles around the edge, making big circles. And I was doing that, and I was stirring it clockwise around the pan, and he said, what have we got cooking here? And he's watching me. He says, no, not like that, not like that. And he takes my hand and does the exact same movement in the opposite direction. And he said, you got to do it this way or it'll burn. And I thought, oh, okay, I don't want it to burn. I didn't think that, I'm doing the exact same motion, just in the other direction. Anyway, and my grandma said, John, leave her alone, she's fine. He said, no, you got to do it this way. And so to this day, when I stir a pan, I do the counterclockwise little loops all the way around the pan. If I'm making a roux, or I don't make cream of wheat anymore, but grits or whatever, I stir it that way. So these are some of my grandpa's very interesting idiosyncrasies. Now my grandpa, after my grandma died, my grandpa would spend all his summers up north in the cabin, and he would go in May, April, May, as soon as the lake opened up. And he would stay till late October. And then he would drive in his Lincoln Continental. He wouldn't drive, or he drove it first, but when he couldn't drive anymore, he would ride in his plush, big, huge Lincoln Continental all the way down to Florida. And he would spend his winters in Florida, and then come back again in the spring. So he lived between these two homes. And as he, in his 80s, when he was in his 80s, he developed something that they finally diagnosed it with the name of what the symptom was. They had no idea what was going on with his body, but all of his muscles were atrophying. It was not muscular dystrophy. It wasn't MS or anything like that, but it was something that was just breaking down muscle tissue. And he became less and less able to do anything. He was confined to a wheelchair. His arms grew weak. He was becoming more and more crippled. And so this one October, my brother Tom was up there, and it was about time, the leaves had started falling, and it was time for him to head back south to Florida. And my brother Tommy was there with his young family, Carol and little toddler Allison, and they were visiting Gramps. And that afternoon, he called all his children and just talked to them all, and told them stuff, and just had long conversations with each one of his kids. And although he didn't do that very often, it was very welcome by all of them. So Tom went and visited him after supper, and they sat at the table, and Gramps told him to go to the medicine cupboard and take out the bottle of whiskey. And he said, "Get 2 glasses, Anna." Anna was his helper, and his hands, two glasses, Anna. And he put a glass in front of Tom, and he put a glass in front of himself, and he poured each of them a glass of whiskey. And he just said, "Here's to us." And they drank the whiskey. Now, my grandfather had a glass of whiskey every night before going to bed. 1 glass of whiskey every night before going to bed. But this night, he said, Tom, give me your glass." And he poured a second, and he poured himself another one with a little bit more than the last one. And he sat and he sipped that, and he talked and told stories, and told Tom how proud he was of him, and how great it was to have his little girl there, and all this great stuff. And Tom was sipping on his whiskey as Gramps poured himself a little bit more. This was very unusual. My grandfather did not overserve himself. But Tom figured, he's leaving for Florida. They were going to be making plans, and he was going to be heading down there pretty soon. So he sat with him until Gramps had finished his drinks, and he called Anna to take him in his wheelchair. He wasn't in his big chair at the head of the table. He was sitting in his wheelchair. He said, I'm going to bed now, Tom, and you stay and you finish that whiskey if you want to." And Tom said, "Oh, thanks, Gramps, but I got to get Carol and Allison home." So they left, and that night my grandfather went to bed. And apparently, this was not just a weakening disease, but it was also painful to him. And he saw the writing on the wall. He was not getting better. And the trip to Florida would have just been excruciating. And he decided that he was not going to leave up north, that night he was going to take his life. And he did that. And he went to sleep, and he just didn't wake up. He took some extra pills that he'd been saving, and went to sleep and didn't wake up. And we all mourned him, and we all, told stories. He's just this great guy. We laughed and told stories about how you couldn't leave anything on the dock, because, especially when he was older and a little more handicapped, that if you had anything on the dock, he didn't move it to the side. He'd walk on the dock, and with his cane, he'd just chuck it into the water. So if you left your towel there, ploosh, it was in the water. And we told all these stories and just remembered him. And then I came back here, and then that was he passed away in October, middle October. And that next summer, well, after he passed away, my mother inherited his cabin up north. So that next summer, before anybody else was going up north, even before my mom was going up, her house was not opened up. But my grandpa had a guy who would open up his cabin really early, because he would come there early. And so his cabin was already opened. And so Bunce and I decided to take the kids and go up north when nobody was there and stay at Grandpa's cabin. It was going to be so much fun. And while we were riding up there, I'm telling my kids stories about myself as a child, staying up there, and remembering, telling some of my grandpa's stories as we got there. And when we got in, it had been opened up. We felt it was so amazing walking in. It was the last time I had walked in there. I went to greet my grandfather, and I just thought about him, and you could feel him there, like you feel someone who's passed in their place, and not in a creepy way, but just he was there. And we kind of settled in a little bit, and that day, put some things away, and he had put in an addition on this cabin that had this big bedroom with a king-size bed that was his bed. And my family, when my children were little, we had a family bed, and almost all of us slept in the same bed. I know we are those kind of people, but look how they turned out, right? Anyway, so he had this big king-size bed, and we decided that we would sleep in the big bed so that we could all sleep together in my grandpa's big bed. And we put stuff away in drawers, and I was obsessively sweeping that house. And when we cooked food, we had stopped at the store and gotten stuff to cook dinner, and I instantly cleaned everything up. You never left a dish in the sink at my grandpa's house. Everything was just spotless, and I swept like 3 times, and it was like obsessive, and it was conditioning from my childhood, I thought. But then we had the car keys. There was, at the edge of the stove, there was one of those metal rolling, serving carts from the 50s that have the 3 shelves, and we had set the car keys on the shelves there. And so even though we had traveled that day, on our first night, we thought we'd just go on a very short deer ride to get the kids in jammies and just go on a deer ride our first night there. And we go to get the car keys, and they're not there. And I, of course, immediately start blaming Bunsen, saying, "Did you leave them in the car?" He says, I'll go check. And they weren't in the car. He says, "Are they in your pocket?" I'm blaming him for putting them someplace that they shouldn't have been. But he said, "I put them right there." And I remembered seeing them there. And I said, "Well, where are they?" And we all start searching for the keys. And we're looking on this little hook where keys would go, or the back door, by the front door, everywhere that the keys might be. And we could not find those keys anywhere. And now it's getting too dark for a deer ride, and we're all getting tired. And so we just said, well, never mind. We're not going for a deer ride tonight. Let's just have a little bed night snack here, everybody up at the table, and then we'll cash in. It was a long day of traveling, and so everybody was a little disappointed, but they were already cleaning in their jammies, so it was a good thing. And I walked toward the kitchen to get something for a bed night snack, and right there on that rolling cart were the keys, right there. There is no way we missed those. I mean, we picked stuff up off of that, looking for them, thinking it got under, but the keys somehow showed back up. So that night we tucked in that bed, and as soon as I laid down in that bed, I was like pins and needles. There was just this heaviness around it. Now, this was the bed that my grandfather passed away into. So there's that. But, that stuff doesn't generally bother me. But boy, oh boy, it was intensely heavy. And every one of my senses was piqued. And the kids were restless. They're like, and now it's a new bed, a new place. They've been traveling. But Ezra was a baby, and he couldn't sleep, and Zach was having trouble breathing. He had asthma as a little kid, and he was just all congested, and I was like, this is not cool, and I'm trying to tend all this stuff and could not sleep a wink. And I look over at Bunce, and he's got his eyes he's just looking around like this with his eyes, and I said, maybe we should go sleep out in the other room. And he said, yeah, let's do that. Now, out in the main room, there were I think 3 twin beds that were out in the main part of the living room. Now, this is way late. It's dark, so it doesn't get dark till, 10:30 up there. So this is probably 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. Kids are still in the bed, kind of squirming all over the place. And Bunce and I go out in this room, and we pull the top mattresses off of all these twin beds and push them up next to each other in the middle of the floor, in the main part of the house, right by the dining room table, away from the new part away from the addition that had been built on. And we lay these mattresses on the floor, and we pull the blankets up over us, and we carry the kids out there and tried to sleep out there. And the kids were much calmer. And Bunsey fell asleep, and I would doze off, and I'd wake up. And I thought he fell asleep, but talking to him about this as a recall for this story, I he said there was so much going on in that room all night. There were noises, there were scraping noises, like if there was a glass on the table going, like just all kinds of stuff happening out of that room. And none of us were able to sleep. So I was like, dude, we can't stay here. We cannot stay here. This is just, I really don't want to stay here. But our house, my mom's place, was not opened up. And she said to call Uncle John because he had like this small apartment in a house by his, which was right there on the same lake. So I called Uncle John. He said, yes, absolutely, we could stay there. So we went and stayed at his place, and everything was fine. We put all the mattresses back and swept the floor again and cleaned everything up and closed the door and said, okay, Gramps, we're not staying here. It's cool. And we didn't stay there. And I never stayed there ever since. But don't worry, if you're watching this, he's not still there. There were other stories from there, like Mimi, my sister Mimi, went up, and she was there with a friend of hers, and they were staying in the cabin, and they were down on the dock and they were sunbathing on the dock, and they put out their lawn chairs, and they had their towels, their beach towels, and their sunscreen and all their stuff, and they were there in the morning. They decided to go up and make a lunch and then go back down. And so they just left all their stuff on the dock, and they went back up. No one else was there, okay? Nobody else was anywhere near there. And they went up in the house, and they were making some sandwiches when Mimi's friend said, oh, God, Mimi, look at this. And she goes to the window, and just in time to see one of the lawn chairs just fly off the dock, just fling off the dock into the water. And she's like, whoa, is it windy out? And none of the trees are moving. There's no wind. And then, boom, the other one goes off the other side of the dock. And then all the stuff, just is chucked into the lake. Everything that was on the dock is off of the dock. And Mimi's like, oh, I guess Gramps still doesn't want us to leave things on the dock. So the rest of the time they were there, when they were out on the dock and they went to go up to the house, they just took all their stuff off the dock, put it on the beach, and then put it back to appease Gramps because he did not want that stuff on the dock, and you had to do what he wanted always. So there you go. My nephew told me a story once around a campfire where he and a girlfriend went to Grandpa's cabin, and they were going to go into Grandpa's cabin to have a little private moment, shall we say. And they weren't I don't know if they were in his bed or not, because there was another bigger bed there, but they went in his cabin, and things were progressing just the way he hoped they would, when all of a sudden 2 doors went bang, bang, the room door and the bathroom door just boom, boom, like this forceful crash, bang, and it was like, and the two of them just hightailed it right out of there. It was like, whoa, Gramps did not approve of that. And so out they went. So these are just some of the things. So now I'm going to move on many, many years. My Gramps, people that have stayed there since have said that he's not there, that there's nothing. This was the year or two after he had passed. So, but years passed, and my 2 youngest children were experiencing some turmoil and some, life choices and things like that. And it was a time when there was a lot of like spiritual psychic things happening. There was like this big awakening kind of time at that time as well as now. And my younger daughter, Era, said to me that she was kind of freaked out because Gramps kept coming to her at night, and in her dreams he would be standing at the foot of her bed and trying to get her attention and trying to tell her something that she didn't know what he was trying to tell her. And she was trying to understand what he was trying to tell her. And it had something to do with a ledger or a diary or a logbook or something that was in his tool house. And he wanted her to find this thing, but it was not coming across. It was not, she wasn't understanding exactly what he wanted. And he said to her, just let me come into you. And she would wake up. This scared the hell out of her. And when she told me this, I said, oh no, you just say no. You never let anything enter into you to be able to use your body for their means ever. I told you a story about this. You just don't. That's not okay. And so then I started talking to my grandfather, and I said, you need to back off. You need to leave my kids alone. At the same time, Ezra was having dreams about my grandfather, the same kind of things. He is bothering him in his sleep, waking him up, and telling him that he's got to do this stuff, telling him what he wants him to do. And Ezra is a kid, he's 18 or so. Just this, and I had it. I was like, Gramps, if you have something that you want people to know, you could tell me, but you need to leave them alone, or I'm not putting up with this. And of course he ignored me because that's what he does. Well, then I went to Chicago for a family gathering, and my sister Colleen was there. And she had inherited my grandfather's beautiful black cashmere dress coat with a satin lining that had been handmade for him by a tailor. It had his initials embroidered inside in the lining. It had inside pockets for his wallet. It had these deep satin pockets. It was this beautiful coat. And she brought it to Annie's house, and she said, she told me that I should have this coat. And I said, are you serious? She says, it's in the back of my closet. It's not doing anybody any good there. And this is something you could wear. And it's a super warm, beautiful, vintage cashmere coat. And I'm like, really? Are you serious? And she says, yeah, try it on. And I put my arms in it and put it around, and it fit perfectly. And it felt so good. And it still, even after all those years, it had a hint of my grandfather's scent, which was very distinctive. There was no one else I knew that had that cologne or that smell. And I buttoned it up to make sure that it fit, and the middle button was missing. And it had these large black buttons, but the middle one was missing. And I thought, well, I'll either find one like it, but they were big black buttons, or I'll replace them with a matching set. And I buttoned it up except for that middle button, and I put my hand, it felt so great. I put my hands in the pockets, these deep satin pockets. It felt so good. And in the bottom of the right-hand pocket was the missing button. So I'm like, sweet, I'll just put that button back on. I put it back in the pocket. I said, you sure I can have this? And she said, have at it. So I took that coat, and man, is it a beautiful coat. And so that was, when was that? Oh, I don't know. But I hadn't repaired the button yet. And when I got it home, I had been, okay, so let me tell you that just prior to this, I had been doing some research on hoodoo. And this is the root work and the folk remedies in medicine of my ancestors, New Orleans root work. And I'd gotten some books, and I was studying how natural herbs and roots and oils could be used for medicinal purposes and for conjuring purposes and for spells and things like that. And I had all these different supplies. I was really educating myself on these practices of that my ancestors probably participated in. And as I was reading this, all this folklore and all these spells and incantations and little ritual practices, I saw my grandfather. All of his little quirks were actually hoodoo rituals. The thing with scooping the crumbs off the table, that's what you do, and throw them on the floor to feed the house spirits so that you don't neglect your house spirits and they protect you and your home and don't get angry and create, mischief. Keeping track of all your tools so closely, in voodoo especially, but hoodoo as well. If you want to do a ritual or a spell for an individual or against an individual, if you needed to use something that belonged to them, something that they handled, like a tool, something from their body, like a thread from their clothing, or some hair, or a toenail or fingernail, all the stuff Gramps picked out of the garbage can, you could use that for hoodoo spells. The other thing is one hoodoo, like a crossing spell, is that the person who wanted to cause mischief on someone else or harm to someone else would sprinkle salts and other herbs and things on their doorstep, on their stoop, very lightly so you couldn't see it. And then the person themselves, as they walked into the house, would carry that spell with them into the household. And so to avoid this, of course, you would have to sweep your stoop multiple times a day and discard the remnants of it away from your home, away from your dwelling. So you couldn't sweep it just off to the side. You had to throw it over the hill beyond the alarm bell. Yeah. So these were all things that my grandpa did. And whether it was just habit because he watched his parents do these kinds of things, that they watched their parents do, or whether he was a practitioner, I do not know for sure. I would never assume that to be fact, but he was raised in a culture where these things kind of made sense to him. And now I had his coat and I had his button, and he was still harassing or troubling, not harassing, troubling my children. And so I spoke to him again and I said, Gramps, you need to stop this or I'm going to just make you leave. And of course, he didn't believe me, and he had an agenda and he had something very important he needed to tell them. And I'm sure he did have something very important he needed to tell them. But it was bad timing for them and for us. And so I planned a ritual to bind him. And Era and Ezra and I took the button, I wore his coat. I wasn't going to bind him in a bad place, in a dark place. I wasn't going to cut him off or banish him or exorcise him. It was not my intention. But I needed him to back off, and so that we could have some peace during this time. And I needed him not to tell us what to do at this time. And so we took the button. I wore his coat. I had the button in the pocket, and I prepared it ahead of time with the special oils. I put together a kit of everything I would need to do a binding. And we went to the spring because this was the most sacred and peaceful place. And I wanted my grandfather to be at peace more than anything. I wanted him to leave my kids alone, but I wanted him to have some peace, you know? He was so stressed out. He was so frantically worried. That comes into another story I'll tell a different time. But so we got there, and there's this very, very, very steep hill to get down to the spring. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, if I was going to put it in the spring or what. I knew that I would know when I got there. So Ezra walked in front of me, and he wore a backpack, and I held on with both hands to his backpack, and Era was behind me and held on to me so that I wouldn't fall. It was very precarious, and I don't do that stuff well. And we made it down there, and when we got to the spring, we didn't speak the whole way, the three of us. We knew exactly what we needed to do. And when I got there, I noticed that in the oak tree, there's this giant oak. The roots touch both the spring and the river and the creek and all of the wet, all the water out of the earth. And when we went, it was November, and it was just snowing, these big giant snowflakes. And so there was water in the sky and in the ground and everywhere. And we made our way down this hill, and I saw in this oak this little crevice in the bottom, and it was like a split in the very bottom with a little opening, and I thought, that's where to put the button. So without speaking, I spoke the incantation and prepared the spell And Aaron and Ezra did their parts. We started with sage smoke. We took water from the spring. I mean, I could tell you the whole ritual, but we did all the stuff that we needed to do. And then I blessed the button and I thanked my grandfather. And I told him I was going to put him here for the time being, where he could find some peace. And I called on the spirits of that place to protect him and to honor him. And I put that button in the tree. And we left. And there were no dreams, no more dreams. And he was not here. He was bound there until the next year. Now the next year, excuse me, I'm going to pour a little bit. I may go over the hour. I hope you don't mind, because I got to finish this story. So the next year, my mother was turning 80. And my mother had done all the research on the family, and she loved New Orleans. And she, when she was there, the first time she was there, it was her city, and she felt so connected to that city. So for her 80th birthday, my sister Mimi hatched this wonderful scheme to bring my mother to New Orleans and to have all of her 10 children and their spouses and their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, as many as who could come, to all come to New Orleans for my mother's birthday as a surprise. And she and her partner hired a brass band, and we were going to do a second line up Galvez, her street in the Treme. And my mother knew nothing about this. She knew that Mimi had brought her to New Orleans for her 80th birthday, her and my father. And they were sitting on her front porch, and Mimi told her that she had to go do something. Mark was working. Meanwhile, we were all gathering. It was Palm Sunday. We were all gathering a few blocks away, and the band comes, and we're down at the end of the street. And, you know, in New Orleans, you can sign up for parade, and the police, you know, lead you. And so my mother is sitting on the porch with my father, and she hears a band coming up the street, and she has no idea who it's going to be. Well, now, we're going to do this, we call it Granny Gras. We're all going to meet in New Orleans. And I'm thinking this is just the most amazing, wonderful thing to honor our mother. And I knew that all our ancestors who had been left behind, and with us coming back and honoring that place, I knew they were all going to be there. And I started thinking of Gramps. And I started thinking, oh man, he should be there too. And then I had this scheme that I was going to unbind him, and I was going to bring the button to New Orleans. And in New Orleans, there's the property where my grandfather was born on St. Anne Street is now a park that my family had bought and then deeded to the community foundation, to the neighborhood group or whatever. And in it, it's just a little park that's kept taken care of, and there's a monument there to my ancestors and my family. And my scheme was to bring this button to New Orleans and bring my grandpa home to where he was born. And I thought this was just the coolest idea ever. And so a week before we were going to New Orleans for Granny Gras, this huge, wonderful secret thing, I had my husband and sons take me back to the spring. And I said, I didn't tell them I was going to unbind the button. I didn't tell anybody. And unbind my grandpa and retrieve the button. So we got there, and the boys were fishing, and Bunsey was foraging, and Layla was off looking for, frogs and whatnot. And I went right to the tree, and I had brought with me in my pockets what I needed to unbind my grandfather. And they were all away from me, and I did the unbinding, the words and the ritual. And then I bent down to look for the button, and I didn't see it. And I thought, oh crap, some animal has dragged it off into, to offer. So anyway, I just reached in, and I felt the button, and I pulled it out, and I put it in my pocket, and I said, Gramps, I'm going to take you home. And he was back. And I took that button and I have this carved wooden box, and I put it in the carved wooden box on my dresser. And I told Gramps, you could be here. I'm going to take you home. And that was all that I said. And then the day that we packed to go, the button was still in the carved box, and I packed my suitcase up. And the last thing I packed, I took the button and I had this, it was like a soap container, a travel soap container that I put my travel jewelry in. And I put the button in with my jewelry and I snapped it shut. And I immediately put it in the zipper pocket of my suitcase. And then Bunce carried it down, put it in the car, and we left. And we drove straight through, almost straight through. We stopped and slept in Memphis in a big snowstorm, it's not snowstorm, rainstorm, for a couple hours because neither of us could see anymore. But it's 1,000 miles, from here. And we drove straight through because we were limited on time. And so we got to New Orleans and we got to this hotel. My mother still didn't know we were all going to be there. You're going to probably hear some pops and things. People are shooting off fireworks. It's Memorial Day weekend, and of course fireworks for Memorial Day. Anyway, so we get in our room, we check in, put the stuff in the room, and all my brothers and sisters are all down in the courtyard, and everybody's down there having cocktails, and we hadn't seen each other. We were having just a wonderful time with each other. And then we talked about going someplace for dinner, so I wanted to go up and get out of my travel clothes and change, and went up and opened up my suitcase and took all my stuff out, put my jewelry, plastic container on the top of the dresser, and put stuff away and changed my clothes. And when I was going to change my earrings, and opened it up and picked out some earrings, and I looked for the button, and the button was not there. It was gone. And so I looked in the pocket of my suitcase, and maybe it had opened up and it had fallen out, but it wasn't there either. It was completely gone. And I was like, well, I guess Gramps didn't want to come here. And all of a sudden I had a realization that wasn't his home. That was not a place he wanted to go back to. That was a place of pain and for him, and of loss. And so I was like, okay, you win. Once again, you get your way. And I just left it at that, and I thought the button was just gone. But then we had this wonderful trip, and the band played. My mother was, her arms out, welcome to my city. And it was the most wonderful Granny Gras. It was probably my mother's happiest day of her life, I think. And the ancestors were indeed there, including my namesake, who had to leave, and all the others. And so then afterwards we went home, and we drove all the way back. And when I got home, I was so whipped and exhausted. And I went upstairs, and Bunce had just plopped my suitcase down, and I didn't even open it up. And I wanted a nightgown and get in my bed. And I went to my dresser, and I went to open the drawer with my comfy nightgowns. And I looked on the top of my dresser, and right there, plain as day, was, guess what? You're right, the button. So I said, fine, I get it. And I put it back in the carved box. And I closed the box, and it kind of pops shut. And I'm like, I'm not trying to control you anymore. You can be where you need to be to Gramps. He's actually been very helpful to me in many occasions, and that's for another night's story. But I'm not done with the button story, because a few years later, it was spring break. Sorry, I'm chewing ice. I know that's annoying to some of you. It was spring break, and Bunce and I were going to Nashville. And it was going to be my sister Mimi's birthday. And she said, please, all sisters, come to New Orleans for my birthday. It was a big birthday for her. I think it was her 50th birthday or something. She doesn't look 50, but even now. But so I was like, yes, we're going to do this. So Bunce and I went to to Nashville. And I think Mimi even bought me a ticket from Nashville to New Orleans. Thanks, Memes. And so we were there for a few days, and then just for the weekend, all 5 of the Shipper sisters converged on Mimi's house in New Orleans. And knowing we were going there, I did not communicate with my grandfather, Just as we were leaving for Nashville, I kept it out of my mind, out of everything, and I just grabbed the button and I put the button in with my stuff. And I looked at it there, and I looked at it when it was in the car, and I made sure it was there, and I made sure it was there. And when we got to Nashville, I kept it right where, in sight, where I could see it. I was not going to leave him in New Orleans. I had this idea. My sister Annie was writing a book, a novel based on my grandfather's life. And as a writer myself, things that inspire you, like when I'm sitting and thinking of what to write, that you have fidgets and things to just kind of focus your thoughts before you get back to typing. And I thought something of my grandfather's might be something to help Annie with her writing of this story based on my grandfather's life, starting in New Orleans and growing up in the North. And so I brought it with. I was not going to leave him there, and so I left that out. I didn't communicate with him about it. I just grabbed the button. So then when I was going to fly to New Orleans, I took the button and I put it in my bra. I was not taking any chances, and I kept feeling for it, and it was there, and it was right there. And went to the airport, and I could feel it, and I would have to go through security, so I took it out of my bra, and I zipped it into my change purse, still watching my change purse, in my purse, on the belt, and I went through security. And then on the other side, I took it out of my change purse and stuck it back in and carried it there and carried it there all the way to New Orleans. And while I was there, it was still there, and I kept feeling it still there. It was still in my bra. And Annie, while we were there, she read us some of her chapters, and they were just so wonderful. I hope she finishes this because, boy, she was right on. I told her a little bit about his idiosyncrasies and the hoodoo and the culture that I had learned about from Treme and from, that, and she was, she was so right on. And so then one morning, all five of us, if you on a Facebook friend, one of the pictures that I post every once in a while, I think I'll post this one under this, but is a picture of all my sisters and I with our arms around each other in New Orleans. That was that weekend. So it was a morning, and we went to the homestead site on St. Anne Street, and it was early and nobody else was out, and it's this really poor neighborhood, and we were just standing there and talking about our family and talking about how privileged we were and how difficult it must have been to leave such a rich culture. Mimi talked about after Katrina to leave the city and evacuate, how horrible it was to feel the loss of that community and that culture, which has come back. And we were standing there talking, and I just decided right then, I hadn't decided for sure, but I decided right then that I would give Annie the button. And so I told her that I had something of Gramps'. I asked her if she had something. She said she didn't. And I said, well, I have something that maybe you can use as just a fidget, as an inspiration, just to, feel him with you as you write this story. And she said, really? What's that? And I reached in my bra and I pulled out the button. And she said, what's this? And I said, this is from his coat, blah, blah, blah. And she said, are you sure you want me to have this? And I said, I'm sure. I think you should have this for a while. And you could give it back when you're done if you want to. But I want you to have this for now while you're writing his story. And she was very appreciative of that. And she put it right in her tight little jeans pocket. And we went back to Mimi's, and I think we went out to dinner that night, and it was my last night, and I was flying out, and we were dispersing after that, and excuse me. So I flew back to Nashville, stayed another day, and then rode in the car with Buns back to Cadillac from Nashville. It was quite a spring break. So weeks passed, And I'm home, and everything is normal. There's nothing weird going on at all. And I have these aprons that I wear in the kitchen. And they're two aprons that are similar patterns but different fabric. One is a lighter fabric that I choose mostly because it's not as heavy as the other apron. Sorry, I touched my face, but my hands are clean and I'm home alone. And the other one is heavier. It's like almost like an upholstery fabric. They're beautiful. Jessie, Layla's mom, made them for me. And so they're both hanging one on top of the other on this hook. And the one apron I wear all the time, mostly, like I said, until it needs to be washed. And usually I'll put it in the wash after using it, and then when it comes out, I use it again. So I very rarely used the heavier apron. But this one night I'm cooking dinner, and I put the apron on, and it was gnarly. It was like shiny, It really needed washing, and I did not want to cook with a apron, a bacteria apron, can I just say? So I took it off and I put it in the laundry, and I put on my other apron and I tied it around my waist, and I went to the counter and put the onion chopping board on the counter, and there in the way were two safety pins. So I picked up the safety pins, and instead of going and putting them back in the drawer where they were supposed to go because I needed to get dinner on, I just dropped them in my apron pocket. And as I dropped them in, there was this little click. And I'm like, dude, what's in this pocket? Because I hadn't worn that apron in a really long time, like since Christmas, and this is almost summer. And I reach in the pocket, and I pull out two safety pins and this big black button. And I'm like, this looks like Gramps' button. And I know I have not put a button in this pocket. And so I go to the front closet with this button, and I put it next to the other buttons on Gramps' coat, and it's identical. It's his button in my apron pocket. So now I'm like, okay, and I call up Annie. I said, hey, Annie, how's the book coming? Are you finding that button helpful at all? And she said, oh, I really didn't want to have to tell you this. And I'm waiting for it. No, wait for it. She said, after I left Mimi's, I had it with me after you left. I know I had it. And I had it in my pocket, and Bob came and picked me up. He was in the RV. And I know I had it in my pocket in the RV, and I put it in the RV in with my stuff. And I cannot find that button. She said, I lost it. I don't know if I lost it at Mimi's, but I tore apart the RV, and I could not find your button. I'm really sorry I lost your button. I know how much that meant to you. And I said, that's okay. It's here. And she said, no, it can't be there. You left. I had the button after you left. And I said, well, somehow it found its way back here. And it's here. And it's here. And this is the button. Right here. See that there? I know it's dark, but this is my grandpa's button. Somehow, I put it back. Somehow it found its way back to my house where it's remained. And as I said earlier, my Gramps is still with me. And although he seemed to be troubling my children, and I stored him away, I sent him away for a while, he has been a very, very important part of my life recently and has really saved me from making some stupid mistakes. And I honor him, and I'm protecting this button, and I welcome him and his wisdom and all of his little quirks here. I feel like he is one of my guardians, when I am going into something dangerous and I call on my angels and ancestors, I picture him first, and he's there. So, to Gramps, a little bit of whiskey. A little bit of whiskey to my Gramps and to the button. I know this sounds so far-fetched. I can't tell you. Every one of these stories sounds so far-fetched, but I gotta tell you that every single one of these has happened. So, It's an hour 10. That's a little bit long for these. I try to keep them under an hour, but there was just a lot to talk about tonight. I hope you enjoyed this. You know, your ancestors, I think our ancestors are aware of us. And call on them. Listen to them. Some of them went through a pandemic. Some of them survived it and some of them didn't. And some of them have comfort and wisdom that you may be able to understand. And someday, I'm hoping to be someone's ancestor. Not soon, though, please. So I'm washing my hands. I'm still wearing a mask, even though it's, what do they call it now? Virtue signaling? What the hell is that? I will signal virtue every chance I get. So be safe, be kind. Remember, even the people who aren't being safe, everybody has their story. And just like where I thought that my Gramps, I had the best interest, his best interest at heart, I was wrong. Anyway, so 11:11, a perfect time to end. Good night, my friends. Be safe. I guess I'll see you next week because we're still locked down up here in Michigan. Well, not in northern Michigan, but all of us who live here are staying locked down because, well, we want to stay alive. Take care.